There is a very specific kind of person who confuses access to power with power itself. They collect titles. They collect positions on committees and subcommittees of those committees. They build small empires inside institutions that most people ignore, because most people are too busy living their actual lives. And they mistake that indifference, that reasonable, completely normal human indifference, for permission. Gerald Pruitt had been mistaking it for permission for 11 years. He was the board chair of the Millbrook Heights Homeowner Association in the city of Carver Falls, Harwick County. 3-term chair. He held that position because nobody else had ever wanted it badly enough to run against him. He controlled the HOA's relationship with its management company, Pinnacle Community Management, LLC. He had the private cell number of the Harwick County Code Enforcement Supervisor on speed dial. He had a direct line to the office of Deputy Mayor Curtis Vance, a man who had benefited 3 times from Gerald's particular talent for bundling campaign donations from subdivision residents who didn't entirely understand they were being bundled. Gerald Pruitt had real leverage, real political connections, real power within the narrow, self-constructed ecosystem of Carver Falls residential governance. And on the morning of March 14, 2023, he used all of it to dial 911 because my truck's rear bumper was sitting approximately 3 inches over a recorded easement line on my own driveway. I am going to tell you what happened next. But I need to tell you what was actually happening inside Millbrook Heights first, what had been happening for 5 years to 94 families in broad daylight, because the driveway was never the real story. The driveway was the moment Gerald Pruitt made the single most consequential miscalculation of his life. My name is Renata Holt. I am the 19th Chief of Police of Carver Falls. And before we go any further, I want to be honest with you about something. I am not telling this story to cast myself as a hero. Parts of what I did exist in a real ethical gray zone, and I'll tell you exactly where that line is. What I need you to understand is that the money Gerald stole was real. The 94 families he took it from were real, and the political machinery that protected him for 5 years was very, very real. None of it would have unraveled when it did if he had simply let a parked truck go. He could not let it go. That is the story. I spent 22 years in the United States Army. I served in the Military Police Corps, commissioning out of Fort Gordon in 2001 and retiring in 2016 as a lieutenant colonel, with 2 deployments to Iraq and 1 to Afghanistan behind me. In the Army, and specifically in military law enforcement, you develop a particular discipline around documentation. You write it down, you date it, you file it, you cross-reference it. You don't document because you're paranoid. You document because you understand, at a cellular level, that the paper trail is often the only thing standing between order and complete institutional collapse. That habit followed me into civilian life. It would end up mattering more than anything else I did in this story. I transitioned to civilian law enforcement in 2017 and joined the Carver Falls Police Department as a patrol supervisor. Sergeant rank, lateral entry, about as humble a re-entry as a lieutenant colonel could manage. I did not mind it. I spent 2 years on patrol, moved to investigations, put 3 years into major crimes, and was appointed deputy chief in 2022. In January 2023, the Carver Falls City Council confirmed my appointment as chief. I moved to Millbrook Heights in October 2022, 3 months before the confirmation was public. My daughter Camille was 12, starting 7th grade at Harwick County Consolidated Middle School, 4 blocks from the subdivision. I had spent 2 years in a 1-bedroom apartment near the department, yet not wanting to commit to a mortgage until I knew where Camille's schooling would land. When I toured the house at 14 Crestview Hollow, 4 bedrooms, a proper yard, room enough to feel like a home and not a waiting room, I signed the purchase agreement the same afternoon. I read the CC and Rs, all 41 pages. I made margin notes. I flagged the driveway easement provision, because I am the kind of person who flags driveway easement provisions. Millbrook Heights, like most Harwick County subdivisions built during the 1990s development expansion, had a recorded 3-foot community access strip running along the left side boundary of each home's driveway, designated common area in the original 1994 subdivision plat. Under Harwick County Municipal Code Section 47-112C, homeowners retained a permanent use easement for vehicle ingress and egress, meaning, plainly, that I could park in my own driveway. What I did not fully absorb was that the HOA technically retained the right to fine any homeowner whose vehicle encroached on that 3-foot line. I noted it, I moved on. My truck had parked in roughly that position at every house I'd lived in for the last decade. Nobody had ever said anything. I did not yet know that Gerald Pruitt had been turning that 3-foot strip into a revenue source for 5 years. Let me tell you about Gerald Pruitt. 61 years old, retired from a mid-level management role at a Carver Falls insurance brokerage in 2018. The same year, not coincidentally, that Pinnacle Community Management took over the Millbrook Heights contract. He had lived in the subdivision since 2004. His daughter went to Vanderbilt on a partial academic scholarship. He mentioned this regularly in casual conversation, as though her achievement was a reflection of his own. He had the conversational rhythm of a man who had spent years ensuring he was always the most informed person in every room he chose to enter, which mostly meant he had spent years choosing very small rooms. His tenure as board chair had produced a steady accumulation of policy changes that residents accepted, because most of them didn't have the time or the inclination to dig into the specifics. In 2019, he pushed through an amendment increasing the maximum daily fine from $50 to $75 per violation. In 2020, done a board resolution authorizing Pinnacle to issue fines directly, without requiring a full board vote, for previously documented violation categories. In 2021, a change to the reserve fund management policy that allowed funds to be drawn for capital improvement consulting at the board chair's sole discretion, without a supermajority. Each of these passed on unanimous board votes at meetings noticed by email. Emails that multiple residents later told me consistently ended up in their spam folders. Attendance at board meetings since 2018 averaged fewer than 4 residents per session. Gerald also maintained what several neighbors described as a physical presence in the neighborhood that was difficult to categorize as anything other than active surveillance. He walked the subdivision 2 or 3 times per day with a camera and a manila folder, a standard letter-sized folder that he carried under one arm and opened periodically in view of residents' windows, theatrically, as though reviewing intelligence. He had submitted over 340 individual violation complaints to Pinnacle since 2018. Those complaints produced 218 individual fines across 73 of the 94 properties. Nobody had ever successfully contested a fine. The appeals process, buried in Section 7.4 of the CC and RS, required a written request within 15 days, a $50 non-refundable processing fee, and attendance at a formal hearing before a panel convened at the board chair's discretion. The panel was convened by Gerald. The panel consisted of Gerald and whichever 2 board members he selected. Every appeal on record had been denied. When I moved in that October, Gerald welcomed me personally. He knocked on my door 2 days after closing, introduced himself, and handed me a printed copy of the community guidelines. He shook my hand and told me he ran a tight ship. He smiled when he said it. I smiled back. I thought, this man is exactly what he appears to be. I had no idea how right I was. March 14th, 2023. A Tuesday. I was at my kitchen table at 9:30 in the morning, reviewing a department strategy briefing package ahead of an afternoon session with my captains. Camille was at school. My truck, a 2019 Ford F-250, black, registered to 14 Crestview Hollow in the name of Renata Holt, was parked in my driveway. The rear bumper sat, as it had sat every day since I moved in, approximately 2 to 3 inches over the recorded community access strip. At 9:47 a.m., my personal cell rang. Sergeant Marcus Webb, one of my shift supervisors. "Chief," he said carefully, "I need you to know, we just received a 911 call about a blocking vehicle at 14 Crestview Hollow. That's your address." I asked what was reported. He read from the call log. A vehicle described as a large commercial-type truck was obstructing a community access easement, creating a public safety hazard. The caller had requested immediate police response. "Who called it in?" I asked. A pause. "A Gerald Pruitt, ma'am, same address block." I told Marcus to send the units. Standard dispatch, standard procedure, no special handling. I told him to make sure responding officers treated this call exactly as they would any other, and that I would be present and fully cooperative. Then I hung up. I sat at my kitchen table for a moment with the briefing document open in front of me. I want you to sit with what just happened. This man called 911, not the HOA's violation hotline, not the non-emergency tip line. The emergency line, the line that exists for fires, medical crises, active criminal incidents, to report that my truck's rear bumper was 3 inches over a property line on a quiet residential street on a Tuesday morning in a neighborhood where no emergency of any kind existed. Think about what that decision tells you about a person's relationship with authority. Think about what it tells you about how completely they have come to believe that the mechanisms they've learned to exploit are real power. Officers Dana Yee and Terrence Pratt arrived at 9:53. Both were first-year officers. Both had attended the department-wide all-hands in February, where I had been formally introduced as incoming chief. By their own later accounts, they were working very hard to appear professionally neutral when I opened the door. I told them to do their jobs, completely, exactly as they would for any resident on any street. Officer Yee measured. 2 to 3 inches of overhang confirmed. She pulled up the easement documentation. I had my copy ready because I keep hard copies of my property records, and verified that my vehicle position fell within my recorded use easement rights under Section 47-112C. No citation was warranted. She noted it in the incident report. Officer Pratt's report documented that the complainant, Gerald Pruitt, had positioned himself at the end of my driveway throughout the officer's visit and had expressed dissatisfaction with the outcome. His quoted statement, as written by Officer Pratt, "This isn't over." The officers left. Gerald stood at the foot of my driveway for another 4 minutes before walking away. I watched from the window. Then I opened a new document on my laptop. At the top, I typed the date, and below it, Millbrook Heights, initial observations. I want to be clear about something. I am not an impulsive person. I did not open that document out of anger or wounded pride. I opened it because Gerald Pruitt's behavior, the frequency of the fines, the surveillance walks, the 911 call, had the pattern signature of someone who had been doing this for a long time and believed they were completely insulated from consequences. In 22 years of military law enforcement, I had seen that signature before. It generally indicated one thing: there was something underneath that was worth protecting. I spent the next 2 weeks pulling every publicly available record I could access. I filed a request under the Arliss State Open Records Act for all HOA-related code enforcement referrals in Harwick County between January 2018 and the present. I drove to the county recorder's office on 3 separate lunch breaks and pulled the original 1994 subdivision plat, the full chain of title on all common areas, every recorded easement modification, and 8 years of board meeting minutes. And I downloaded 5 years of Pinnacle Community Management's annual financial disclosures from the Arliss State Community Association Oversight Bureau. Documents required under Section 14.3 of the Arliss State HOA Act, filed by every licensed management company, reviewed by almost nobody. I reviewed all of them. Yellow highlighter, red pen, kitchen table, after Camille went to sleep. The first discrepancy appeared on page 9 of Pinnacle's 2021 filing. The HOA's operating account balance, as of December 31, 2021, reflected $47,000 less than the sum of collected fine revenue and monthly dues for that calendar year. Not a rounding error, not a bookkeeping offset. $47,000, absent from a single year's account, in a document the management company itself had filed with the state. I cross-referenced 2019, then 2020, then 2022. The pattern held consistently across 4 years. Aggregate discrepancy between total revenue collected and reported operating balances, $87,400. That was the first number. The second was worse. Under Arliss State HOA Act, Section 22.1, HOA reserve funds, the capital repair accounts that protect homeowners from sudden catastrophic infrastructure costs, must be maintained at no less than 10% of the annual operating budget. For Millbrook Heights, based on $185 monthly dues across 94 homes, that floor was approximately $21,000. The reserve fund balance as of January 2023, $4,880. The fund had held $218,000 when Pinnacle took over in January 2018. Over 5 years, $213,120 had been withdrawn through 7 separate board resolutions, each signed by Gerald Pruitt, each citing the same payee for capital improvement consulting fees, Westgate Advisory Partners. I ran Westgate Advisory Partners through the Arliss State Business Registry that night. Westgate Advisory Partners was a wholly owned subsidiary of Westgate Property Services Group. Westgate Property Services Group was the parent company of Pinnacle Community Management, LLC, and on the current advisory board of Westgate Property Services Group, as listed in their most recent state annual registration, Gerald J. Pruitt. He had been paying $213,000 in HOA reserve funds to his own company. He had signed a conflict of interest certification in 2018 stating, under penalty of perjury, that he had no financial relationship with any HOA vendor. I sat with that document for a long time. I want to ask you something directly. What would you have done at this point? You have the documentation. You understand what it means. You're the chief of police of this city. You have the authority to initiate a criminal investigation with a single phone call. But you also live in this subdivision. You are personally named in 11 separate fine notices that are part of the same fraudulent scheme. You are, by any reasonable legal definition, a conflicted party. Would you have been able to separate those two things cleanly? Would you have trusted yourself too? I am asking because I am genuinely uncertain whether I did. Not completely, not in the way I would need to certify under oath. I did not initiate the criminal investigation. That was a deliberate decision, made in full awareness of what it cost me. What I did first was retain an attorney. On May 2, 2023, I walked into the office of Simone Achebe, a Carver Falls real estate attorney with 14 years of HOA and property dispute litigation, and I put 47 pages of documented analysis on her desk. She reviewed everything for 4 days. On May 7th, she called me and said 2 words, "This is fraud." On May 9th, she filed a formal document request with Pinnacle under Arliss State HOA Act Section 11.7, requiring the production of supporting documentation for every fine issued to me, plus a complete accounting of all fine revenue collected from Millbrook Heights homeowners since January 2018. Pinnacle had 30 days to respond under the statute. They did not respond. Meanwhile, Gerald had not stopped. Between March 14th and April 30th, I received 11 additional fine notices from Pinnacle, totaling $1,875 in claimed violations, a garden hose on a wall-mounted reel, 2 notices at $75 each. My mailbox post, which I measured it myself with a tape measure, 1/2 inch below the minimum height in the CC&Rs, 1 notice. My porch light, which Gerald apparently determined was the wrong color temperature, 2 notices. The truck overhang, still $75 per day for 14 documented days, $1,050. I paid none of it. Simone advised me not to. In early June, Gerald made his move. He contacted Deputy Mayor Curtis Vance directly. Within 2 weeks, a Harwick County Code Enforcement inspector appeared at my door with a formal inspection notice citing potential zoning non-compliance with my residential vehicle. The inspector conducted a 25-minute physical inspection. His written determination issued same day. The vehicle was fully compliant with all applicable municipal and county codes. I have that letter. It is framed in my office at the department. I show it to junior officers when I want to discuss what careful documentation looks like. The deputy mayor's involvement confirmed what I had begun to suspect. This was not simply HOA financial fraud. There was a political architecture supporting it. A man with real government access who had protected Gerald's operation because Gerald had helped build his campaigns. And if I, as chief of police, directed department resources at that architecture, at a man who was actively harassing me as a named complainant, I would hand Gerald's defense attorney a conflict of interest motion that could contaminate every piece of evidence and end my tenure before it fully started. On June 18, 2023, I called Deputy A.G. Loretta Shan at the Arliss State Attorney General's Financial Crimes Unit. She had been 2 years ahead of me in the FBI's National Executive Institute program. She was one of the 3 people in my professional life whose judgment I trusted without reservation. I told her what I had. I told her my conflict. I told her I was handing it over entirely, that I would cooperate as a witness and provide every document I had compiled, but that the investigation was hers from that moment forward. I hung up the phone. I closed my laptop. I went back to being chief of police of Carver Falls, which had its own violence and its own crises and its own demands that had nothing to do with my driveway. Handing something over that you built with your own hands, on your own time, something that took 6 months of lunch breaks and late nights, is its own particular kind of discipline. I won't pretend it was easy. The civil case moved faster than the criminal one. On September 12, 2023, Simone filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of 78 Millbrook Heights homeowners against Pinnacle Community Management, LLC, Westgate Advisory Partners, and Gerald Pruitt individually. The claims: breach of fiduciary duty, violation of Arliss State HOA Act Sections 14.3 and 22.1, fraud and unjust enrichment. Simone also retained Warren Delacroix, CPA, a forensic accountant who had spent 16 years working financial crimes investigations for the IRS before going private. Delacroix spent 10 weeks going through the financial records, including additional documents subpoenaed through discovery that I had not been able to access as a private citizen. His formal findings, filed with the court in November 2023. Fine revenue misappropriated from HOA operating accounts, $87,400. Reserve fund depleted through fraudulent consulting payments to related entity in violation of Section 22.1, $213,120. Combined confirmed misappropriation, $300,520. Additional undocumented transfers under active review, estimated between $40,000 and $60,000. Pinnacle's attorneys spent 4 months fighting every subpoena. They filed 2 motions to dismiss, both denied. They attempted to invoke a mandatory arbitration clause buried on page 34 of the management contract. The judge voided the arbitration clause under Arliss State HOA Act Section 9.2, which requires any limitation on homeowner legal rights to be disclosed in plain language at the time of contract signing. It had never been disclosed to anyone. In December 2023, Gerald Pruitt filed a Fifth Amendment notice. This coincided, almost exactly, with the Arliss AG's office formally announcing the opening of a criminal investigation. The civil case settled on February 19, 2024. Pinnacle Community Management and Westgate Advisory Partners agreed to a combined settlement of $412,000. The $300,520 in confirmed misappropriation, plus $111,480 in statutory damages and attorney fees. The reserve fund was restored to its mandatory minimum balance first, from the settlement proceeds. Remaining funds were distributed to the 94 Millbrook Heights homeowners proportionally, based on their tenure in the subdivision. My personal distribution, $3,240. I transferred it directly into Camille's school meal account and told her it was a scholarship from a former neighbor. She thought it was a strange story. She's 12. She'll understand someday. My fine debt, the $1,875 Gerald had been threatening to escalate to a property lien, was voided in full. The Arliss State AG filed criminal charges against Gerald Pruitt in March 2024. 3 counts of breach of fiduciary duty under Arliss Penal Code Section 720.4. 2 counts of wire fraud. 1 count of conspiracy to commit financial fraud. Deputy Mayor Curtis Vance was separately investigated for his role in directing the code enforcement harassment. The AG found insufficient evidence to charge him. I disagreed with that determination. I still do. Gerald Pruitt had 11 years of political goodwill stored up, and he spent it in the plea negotiations. His attorney worked the process for 5 months. In August 2024, Gerald pled guilty to 2 reduced charges: a single count of breach of fiduciary duty and a single count of making a material misrepresentation on a government filing. The financial fraud count was dropped. The wire fraud counts were dropped. The conspiracy count was dropped. His sentence: a $25,000 fine, 300 hours of community service, 18 months of probation, no prison time. He sold his house in Millbrook Heights on September 3, 2024. I was home that morning. I watched the moving truck from my kitchen window. I don't know exactly why. Maybe I needed the physical confirmation that it was actually over. Maybe there's a version of closure that only arrives when you watch the U-Haul pull away. I'm going to be straight with you about how I feel about that outcome because I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve a tidy ending. Gerald Pruitt stole $300,000 from 94 families. Some of them went into credit card debt because of his fines. The Corrigan family, Raymond and Dolores, in their late 60s on Aldersham Lane, had opened a $4,000 line of credit to pay fines they'd been told were escalating toward a property lien. They paid interest on that line for 2 years. When I called Dolores to tell her the settlement had been finalized and her family would receive a distribution, she cried. Not a little. She cried the way people cry when something they had stopped expecting to happen actually happens. I have delivered death notifications in combat zones. I have told families things I never wanted to tell anyone. I thought I had been prepared for most human reactions. I was not prepared for Dolores Corrigan. I am still not sure I was prepared for Dolores Corrigan. Gerald walked with probation and a fine that amounted to less than a tenth of what he took. The system bent for him because the system had bent for him before, and it knew the shape of the bend. I know how systems work. I understand what happens when a defendant has spent a decade cultivating political cover. I understand all of it. Understanding it doesn't make it feel like justice. Pinnacle Community Management, LLC, lost its operating license in the state of Arliss in September 2024. Westgate Property Services Group voluntarily dissolved in November 2024. In January 2025, the Harwick County Commission passed Ordinance 2025-14, requiring mandatory public disclosure of any financial relationship between HOA board members and any management company or vendor under contract with the HOA. The ordinance was developed in part by a working group that included Simone Achebe. It cited our civil case by docket number in its legislative findings. 2 similar cases in neighboring counties that broke during the same period contributed to the political momentum. Millbrook Heights has a new management company. They have a completely new board, 5 members. They are all elected on a transparency platform, with 82% resident participation in the vote, the highest turnout the subdivision had recorded since its founding. The board amended the CC and RS to require monthly financial statements published to a community portal. They eliminated the $50 appeals processing fee. They eliminated the board chair's unilateral authority over reserve funds. My truck is still in the same driveway. I stopped measuring the overhang a long time ago. I think about Gerald Pruitt's decision sometimes. Late nights at the department, when things are quiet and there's space to let thoughts settle. The specific arithmetic of what he miscalculated. He saw a large truck in a residential driveway. He saw a new resident who hadn't yet been absorbed into his system, hadn't yet submitted the first fine payment, hadn't yet accepted the unspoken rule that Gerald Pruitt's authority in Millbrook Heights was simply a condition of living there. He did not see, because he had not done the single thing it would have taken to find out, that the woman at 14 Crestview Hollow had spent 22 years in military law enforcement, had built a career on the discipline of documentation, and had just been confirmed as chief of police of the city he lived in. He called 911 because he believed it would make me feel small. It made him visible. That is the thing about that brand of entitlement. It doesn't disappear when you ignore it. It grows, it refines itself. It builds layers of political protection and institutional habit. But it also develops blind spots, the particular blind spots that come from never having encountered real accountability. And sometimes, if you are patient, if you write everything down, if you understand that the paper trail is always longer than the person laying it expects, sometimes it destroys itself. It just needs the right Tuesday morning to finally do it. If you are living inside a system being weaponized against you, if you've received a fine you can't trace to a real violation, a bill from a management company that never quite shows its math, a notice that lands like a warning more than a correction, here is what I want you to do. Pull every document that management company is legally required to provide. In every state, HOA management companies must file financial disclosures. They must maintain fine logs, they must record board meeting minutes, request them, cross-reference them, date everything you do. The system almost always leaves a trail. You just have to be willing to sit at your kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night with a highlighter and follow it. Leave a comment if you've been there. This community understands something that people who haven't experienced it often miss. That petty authority, left unchecked, is just corruption waiting for enough leverage. Gerald Pruitt had leverage for 11 years. He just never expected to meet someone who had more. Thank you for watching HOA Nightmares. If this story resonated with you, subscribe. We're here every week with the stories, the laminated badge, manila folder, $75 a day fine world does not want told. I'll see you in the next one.